Welcome back to another video here on The Pulse. I want to address the title of this right off the top. The idea that the COVID narrative crumbling is not really supposed to be seen as, hey, you know what, we were right the whole time, gotcha. This is more of a conversation around, what happened over the last couple of years. Can we sit here and really take a look and potentially admit the truth, which is that we had a massive breakdown in overall communication and collective sense making? It's my opinion that we really have to understand that is what happened here. And there are so many things that are now changing in this narrative that people knew all along, but were just completely ignored. And to help break this down and discuss this with me here today is Richard Garner, host of a Third Way podcast. Richard, good to have you back on the show. Give me some of your thoughts. What are you seeing here with regards to the COVID narrative breaking down?
Well, first of all, it's time, right? You and I talked about this probably a couple of times when referencing the mass psychosis. You quite generously called it sense-making, or the breakdown of sense-making, that people were being ignored. I'd say they were being censored, attacked, and worse. But that's why you do what you do, and I do what I do. But as far as the narrative is concerned, we literally have the Scientific American, which you could all argue is the bastion of the scientific community. Their August 3rd edition, the title of that particular article is, the narrative of COVID needs to change. It's time. And I'll actually read you the byline because it's important to hear, kind of almost the lunacy. And you want to talk about feeling gaslit, especially when, not just you and I, but so many other people have been talking about, well, it's not about rejecting the notion of COVID altogether. And it's not about this being the Black Plague. Can we not find some rational, unemotional, objective space in the middle? Well, thank God somebody's finally calling for that, Joe. Scientific American says the new normal for COVID calls for a new narrative. And then the subheader is, we've swung between fear and denial for too long, and we need to talk about this disease from a different perspective. Wow. Breaking news, Joe. What a novel idea. Too bad nobody was saying that 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, a year ago.
Yeah, it feels to me, looking at the whole COVID narrative for the most part, that the idea of, the Great Barrington Declaration, which was put forth, I would say fairly early on in the pandemic, had really laid out a focused protection sort of approach to this entire thing. And that resonated even just from a commonsensical point of view with what we started to understand after about, 30 to 60 days of this virus. When it hit the West, we're talking about the West here. Obviously, there's a bit of a different perspective in where it initially started, but it resonated as the way to go. And we're seeing now that was absolutely correct. But where things become tricky is, the vast majority of the Western influence, which, you could say was the CDC, you could say was Fauci, they were espousing this idea that, no, we need to go aggressive. We need to go what people have called authoritarian. And they even went as far as to try and take down, the leaked emails showed that they tried to take down these scientists, these renowned scientists that wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. They tried to take them down. Obviously, we're seeing that all of this is starting to crumble. We're starting to see the truth. They're almost even starting to admit this a little bit. So what do you see are some of the key ways in which you're seeing this narrative sort of crumble here?
Well, more than just simply, op-eds and conjecture or, even revisionist history like the CDC now changing their mandates, essentially calling vaccinated and unvaccinated people pretty much the same, using words like transient to explain the increased protection of vaccines, but ultimately also using the word waning. So you go back and read what they were talking about a year ago and how they're categorizing vaccine and vaccine protection versus when the president of the United States, Joe, was saying that if you get the vaccine, it will stop, you will not get COVID. When we saw campaigns here in Canada on buses and in subways that said, stop the spread, get the vaccine. Well, obviously, it's pretty difficult to now go out and hold up that narrative when we all know now people that have been double vaxxed, triple vaxxed, 2 boosters that have gotten COVID once, twice, 3 times a lady. So if we're at this particular point you're going to have a very difficult time pushing back and maintaining your original position. The numbers, Joe, are pretty significant. I think in Canada, at least, it was 82% of people got the first 2 shots. The third shot, that dropped to 57%. And the fourth shot or second booster is somewhere around like 20% or less.
Yeah.
So what does that say? It says that the people who were certainly willing to comply and do what they were told to do, what they're asked to do for the greater good, started to, see things a little differently. Yes, COVID fatigue. Yes, people get frustrated with this and that. But ultimately, enough people sort of came to their senses, in my opinion, to go, enough. There's no way that you're going to be able to tell me on a polygraph with a lawyer present where you have to be liable for what you're telling me, that you can guarantee me that the risks of a vaccine relative to the risks of COVID are massively different. Well, no, obviously you tried to tell us that. We have different data now that suggests different things. Denmark recently took it a step further because, again, not as a knee-jerk reaction to some new opinion, the data came in, they analyzed it objectively, and they said, well, the data suggests scientifically and medically that there's such a negligible risk to people under 18 and certainly people under 12 versus what we have seen relative to risk of vaccine injury, myocarditis, and other things from vaccines, that we have now banned vaccines for people under 18 in Denmark. There were articles, Reuters did an article, but again, they avoided using the word bans, and they said Denmark pauses vaccines for people under 18. So back to your original question, I'll take it as a win. It's better than what we were experiencing before, but there's still a long road ahead.
Yeah. And I think, people will come back to what you just said a bit and say, the situation early on through the Alpha and the Delta variant was that, it was a lot more severe and vaccines might have had more value. Whereas now with Omicron, we're dealing with, very much what's a flu-like situation. And so they might say that, the regulators and the government are sort of changing their tune and their narrative because the situation we're in is so different. And while that is true, and I think, you'd probably agree with this, there are still enough instances, like you pointed out, with regards to, stopping the spread. They did go on a tear saying this is what would happen. They claimed for a long time that this would be a pandemic of the unvaccinated. They never put important numbers into context for people. And so, there's literally a huge number of facts and pieces of the narrative that are coming out now that were discussed in these alternative sort of circles, if you will, that are now being admitted at a mainstream level, and they're almost trying to just brush it under the rug as if, well, but it's Omicron now. So that's why we're able to kind of make these claims. And so I just wanted to make that nuance important, because what I'm essentially inviting for people that are hearing what we're saying and saying, well, Alpha and Omicron, different scenario, would be, really to have to go back and look at all of the things that were said that turned out to not be accurate. Because without that, it just seems like, the virus is not as serious, and therefore we don't need as serious restrictions.
There's studies coming out of the UK, for instance, that were publicized, again, in conservative media, that are saying that perhaps the numbers of people who died because of lockdowns, cancer screenings that weren't done, people that didn't get their heart checked, everything from depression, stuff we've discussed multiple times, as have others. And now there's enough data now, it's no longer just speculation, that the numbers of people who died of COVID relative to those other deaths are very difficult to discern as one being more than the other. So you would think we have enough in front of us now to be able to say, okay, understood we didn't know much about this, but we're going to definitely be able to keep our heads about ourselves the next time. But right now, I don't feel a high degree of confidence that would be the case.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about the lockdowns, this was, again, focused protection from the Great Barrington Declaration was essentially a suggestion that instead of the lockdowns, which they knew have been, disastrous in the past, like we already had that knowledge, they suggested, no lockdowns. Instead, let's do the focused protection because the likelihood of actually hurting more people with the lockdowns is very high. And, again, that was censored. And now we're seeing mainstream media start to do that. We're seeing that change within a lot of mainstream media where, I think like you've mentioned before, they're starting to gain a little bit of courage. They're starting to, come together and say, you know what, the things that we've either self-censored in the past or things that we weren't allowed to say on our networks, that's starting to change and they're opening up. I've seen countless stories from the CBC, from Global, from, other US stations as well, where, I'm like, are they writing about that now? Like that's odd. Like that they're starting to change their tune. And I also think that, they're probably feeling that they've lost a huge number of audience due to lack of trust. So it's an interesting time. I mean, things are certainly changing here. Do you have any other final thoughts on how we can look at this? Like, should we be optimistic here?
Well, great way to end. There was a study recently done at the admittedly not all that regarded Arizona State University, go Sun Devils. They did do a study recently about hope. And again, we know there's enough data out there, empirical studies around the idea of I don't want to say positivity, and I certainly don't want to say like rose-colored glasses, ignoring reality in order to focus on the positive. Hope is a different thing. Hope is choosing to focus on the glass half full versus the glass half empty. And usually both of those scenarios exist. Where are you going to devote most of your energy? Well, obviously, for the last 2 or 3 years, most of us have almost been, without the ability to not be dragged down into the negative because it was just pounding you every day. You were gaslit. You were feeling like, what is going on? So understandably, it's been very glass half empty for a while. Mm-hmm. And I would just say right now that there's a reason to be optimistic, cautiously optimistic, and to be encouraged by what we're seeing because, yes, don't get me wrong, there will be efforts again to push a similar disproportionate, irrational mass psychosis response to a crisis. It will happen. It could be happening within the months of fall or into 2023 or every flu season. We don't know. The difference now will be that there will be way less people willing to fall into line than there was the first time. And hopefully that's enough to make a difference.
Yeah, well said. And I think, at the end of the day, we're seeing sort of the, the fruits of people who chose to continue to ask questions, who, had the courage to say, hey, you know what, I don't entirely believe this, even if my friends and my family or maybe even my job are going to see me in a negative light. We're seeing that this is the power of taking that road and doing that sort of thing. And obviously doing this type of questioning in a respectful way and in a way that, is not about who's right or wrong, but just by saying, hey, look, let's really try and get to the truth. It's ultimate truth seeking. We're seeing that. So if people didn't do that, I don't think we'd be in this sort of cautious, optimistic state. So, that's it. That's all on that. Thanks so much, Richard, for coming on and sharing your thoughts on this.
Great stuff, Joe. Thanks.